These are African rhythms, passed down to us through ancient spirits. Feel the spirit, a unifying force. Come on, move with the spirit. Stand up, clap your hands. Groove with the rhythms, get down.
Welcome to Africa World Nail Project. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. Today, thinking through and beyond the limits of catastrophe with Bedour Alagraa. Africa World Nail Project is next. Bedour Alagraa argues that the word catastrophe as an anchor for understanding our Earth's ecology has yet to account for the manner in which the catastrophic is ongoing, yet still tied to an original detonation of sorts, a prompt given to us by Brathwaite. And so, the enigma of catastrophe as a word, as a concept, lies in this tension, that is, between a desire to evade the originary event in favor of the repetition, while also recognizing the event, as it were. A puzzle is presented. It is in following Brathwaite's insistence on both the ongoing presence of an original or inaugural moment and the repetition that Alagraa suggests constitutes the most pressing theory problem concerning the use and exploration of catastrophe today. For Alagraa, part of the problem with our thinking concerning this theory problem is the manner in which liberal scientists' formulations have remained relatively unchallenged. Cedric Robinson adds clarity to this assertion in his essay titled On the Liberal Theory of Knowledge and the Concept of Race when he wrote, "The examples are legion in physical science and in social science. One does a little hand-jive, a little mechanical magic, produces an illusion, and looks for uncritical acceptance and obedience from the audience. Scientific thought does not resolve mysteries so much as it defines them out of existence." It is from here we can see that Alagraa is urging us to think against the claim that we need simply to believe science or have better science or better mechanics so that we might address the problem of our Earth's ecology and its assumed lifespan. Without destabilizing our core assumptions about catastrophe, we run the risk of rendering theory inept for confronting this predicament, and equally run the risk of complacency with the overdetermination of empirical or social science interpretations and political offerings concerning what is essentially a problem for which we have yet to develop an adequate grammar. Today, we explore this in more detail, as well as the role of Caribbean radical thought, Sylvia Wynter, Black studies as the praxis of Black life, and beyond the Anthropocenic frames with Bedour Alagraa. Bedour Alagraa is an assistant professor of political and social thought in the Department of African and African Diaspora Studies at the University of Texas at Austin. She is currently a visiting research scholar in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. A self-described wayward political theorist, she received her PhD from the Department of Africana Studies at Brown University, where she was also an Andrew Mellon Graduate Fellow. She holds a BA in political science from the University of Toronto and a master's from the London School of Economics. Bedour's work explores the contours of Black radical genealogies in political theory, histories of political concepts, Caribbean thought, African anti-colonial thought, and Black Marxisms. She has also studied and written extensively on the works of Jamaican writer Sylvia Wynter. She recently completed the archiving of Wynter's papers along with a group of 5 other scholars, and is also a member of the editorial team currently editing Wynter's monograph, Black Metamorphosis. Dr. Alagraa is also the co-editor of a volume of Chairman Fred Hampton's speeches alongside Chairman Fred Hampton Jr. titled I Am a Revolutionary, Speeches by Chairman Fred Hampton, forthcoming from Pluto Press in early 2023. Her book, The Interminable Catastrophe, forthcoming from Duke University Press, writes against the discourse of imminent disaster and considers the predicament of catastrophe as a grammar problem, which requires a rereading of Black radical thought in order to find an escape from circulating discussions concerning our planet's bad infinity, borrowing from Hegel's status and lifespan. Through the ideas of the works of Sylvia Wynter, Kamal Brathwaite, C.L.R. James, Derek Walcott, Clyde Woods, and others, the interminable catastrophe seeks to push against the constitutive limits of the Anthropocene and Anthropocenic lens and opt instead for a theoretical escape from this frame via a reconceptualization of the catastrophic. Dr. Alagraa has published in several peer-reviewed journals, including Critical Ethnic Studies, Contemporary Political Theory, the C.L.R. James Journal of Caribbean Philosophy, Small Acts, and Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, culture, and society. She is currently co-editor alongside Anthony Bogues of the Black Critique book series at Pluto Press. Our show is produced today in solidarity with the Native, Indigenous, African, and Afro-descendant communities at Standing Rock, Venezuela, Corporation Jackson in Jackson, Mississippi, Brazil, the Avalon Village in Detroit, Colombia, Kenya, Palestine, South Africa, Ghana, Haiti, and other places who are fighting for the protection of our land for the benefit of all peoples. Listen intently, think critically, act accordingly. Enjoy the program. Thank you for taking the time to be with us today. How are you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks.
So, I wanted to have a conversation with you today and really to explore, the intellectual projects or just to kind of really have a deep dive into this thing that we call Black studies, right? The various ways of how we go about doing our work. And of course, you have a robust intellectual project that you're really engaged in at this particular point. Of course, your book is coming out pretty soon. And so what I wanted to do is just to start off with this particular question. How did you come to your work? How do you see, or what do you see as your intellectual project?
So this one might be a longer one because my journey has not been a linear one. I mean, I know for most people it's not the case, but so I'm from Toronto, Canada. I'm not American. And so that has first and foremost played a large part in how I've kind of bobbed and weaved a little bit in and out of certain spaces and kind of always been a little bit of a outsider insider in a lot of ways. But so I'm from Toronto and I did my BA in political theory at the University of Toronto. And, anybody who is familiar with the kind of political theory world knows that that's a conservative department. Generally, you do a lot of, Hegel, Kant, Rousseau, Locke, Hobbes, maybe you'll do Arendt if the professor is, really just a wayward one, so that's the kind of department that I did my BA in. And, essentially I wanted to do like a fifth year so that I could just take some of the classes that I wanted to and read, at least in a classroom, some of the things that I'd already been interested in and, Black radical intellectuals, etc. So instead of doing a fifth year, I decided to do a master's at the LSE. A lot of Canadians do that because there's like tons of scholarships available because of the Commonwealth relationship. So I ended up going to the LSE to do my master's, and my MA advisor was Paul Gilroy. And so he was very, very instrumental in, I guess, giving me the idea, even in the first place, that I could be an intellectual, a scholar, an academic. If you had said this to me as an undergraduate, I probably would have thought you were joking. I mean, I'd always been very bookish and studious and all of these things, but in my mind, that didn't necessarily equate to becoming a scholar or professional academic in any sense. And so when I was there, I very much kind of dived into this specific tradition that I'm now really interested in, which is this kind of like mid-century Caribbean intellectual tradition. George Lamming, Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, C.L.R. James, even as late as Stuart Hall, especially. So, time comes for me to finish my master's and, we're discussing and he's telling me, you really should do a PhD. And I was like, oh, yeah, right. I don't want to do that. Why would I spend my time doing that when I could do something, I don't know, that's like more fun or, I didn't consider it seriously at all. I went back to Toronto and I worked for a little bit, and I stayed in touch with Paul, and he would bring up occasionally, this idea of the PhD, you should. And finally I said, okay, well, I don't even know where to start. I'm Canadian. I know I want to do a PhD in a Black Studies department, maybe political theory if there's some buddy there that could like give me something of both. I had no idea what schools to even look at, And so I asked him, could you like, I don't know, send me a list, something? Because I had to go on google.com to learn about what the Ivy League was. I didn't even know what it was. I heard about it on TV, I guess, but that was it. And so he gave me a list, and one in particular, he said, because of your background in political theory and because you are really into this kind of like mid-century Caribbean intellectual tradition, I really think there's one guy who like really fits. His name is Anthony Bogues. You got to go find him. He's at Brown University, because when it comes to both those things, political theory and like Caribbean intellectuals, he's the guy. And I was like, okay, sure. Yeah. So when I looked him up and I was like, oh, wow, he really is that guy. Like he's the one, And so I applied to Brown. I applied to a bunch of places. And in the end, I was choosing between 3 schools, I think. I won't mention their names, but I had conversations with Tony Bogues, and I realized very quickly that this was someone who took very seriously the idea of being a scholar and activist intellectual. He had lived such a varied life, as the chief of staff for Michael Manley, and then before that being a kind of trade unionist and running political education programs when he was like a teenager, and then, running around, Jamaica and, trying to galvanize the Garveyite movie at the age of like 17, just an immensely varied, he'd done it all. And so in addition to the kind of like scholarly acumen, which was of course immense, I was like, okay, I think he can teach me a lot of things that I'm looking to learn. So I ended up at Brown, and then it was just like full speed ahead. I really appreciated Brown's program, especially at the time, because it really felt like the graduate students were genuine colleagues of the faculty. We worked closely and worked together on everything. And because of that, you meet, Brown Africana students who graduated out of that time, and everybody says the same thing, like, you guys are no joke, So the first project that I ended up working on directly with Tony Bogues was when the SNCC Legacy Project recorded one of their sessions at Brown University. And working on that, he told me that he noticed that I had a really good way of being around elderly people, just kind of like, hey, do you want something to drink? Like, you want to go lay down? Like, do you need help doing anything? Like, can I make you a sandwich? Like, stuff like that, right? And because of that, he invited me to work on archiving George Laming's papers, because he was heading up that project as well. And so it was simply because like I liked being around elders and knew how to do it. He didn't know anything about me at that point. It was my first semester, right? All he could see was that. And that made me understand and appreciate what kind of intellectual he was, because for him, that was the thing. Like everything else you can teach, so you can read all the books you can do, but there are certain things that you can't really like teach from scratch, especially to an adult, which is what graduate students are. So then working on the George Laming project. And then after that is when I was roped into working on the winter papers. And at that point, I'd been studying winter for like those years that I was at Brown. And I was totally that was it. And then, so that's the part of like the schooling part. And then the project itself was my dissertation. And so specifically, it grew out of my initial research proposal when I, applied, which is what I wanted to study, catastrophe. But it was more so that I wanted to study how different understandings of sovereign power shape how Black people respond to moments or iterations of catastrophe. I was working through that. And then in Johannesburg in 2017, I was at a conference, and it was myself and only one other graduate student there. And at the conference was Tony Bogues and Michelle Mbembe, and Brian Meeks was there, R.A. Judy, Hortense Villers, like all these people, and I was presenting on my project for the first time. And after I gave the presentation, it was actually Hortense Villers. They came up to me and said, this bit about catastrophe, everything else is really great. Fold it all under this thing you're doing about catastrophe, because I feel like that'll be the way to go. And she was totally right. you know? And then after that, I decided to do that. And then, Tony Bogues was reading what I had and he was like, yes, but you're going to have to start again. And I was like, start again? I've written like a whole chapter and an intro. He said, no, start again. Because what do you mean when you say catastrophe? And I was like, well, Kamau Brathwaite says this. And, I was like so clever and so smart. I was like, I know everything anyone has that. And he said, well, what do you think? Is that sufficient for what you're trying to do? And I realized that it wasn't, and it was okay to say that, and that it didn't make you not thoughtful or overly critical or, unstudied, right? To suggest that what was available to me was not sufficient, although it was necessary, but not sufficient. And so then that's when I made the hard left and just decided to start again and write about what catastrophe means. And that's it. Just a story about what it is, and that's it. Yeah.
And that's a very important story. But I just want to go back just a little bit. So you talked about the intellectual genealogy. I want to pull in the community. I want to pull in the community within which you come that produced you as a thinker, but also as a person who is developing a project that is rooted in, as we're going to get to, that's really rooted in the real material lives of Black folk around the world. Talk about your community that produced you as well.
Yeah. I mean, it would be hard to pick one community that produced me because I feel like I'm a product of a constellation of communities that was always orbiting one another and oftentimes like crossing paths and colliding, sometimes in a good way, sometimes those collisions were bad, but that's how community works. But being from Toronto, I grew up in, at that time, Toronto was a Black city, right? And it was very much that. And it was mostly kind of like heavily influenced by, I guess it would be second generation at that time, Caribbean diaspora, especially from Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados. You would have like, Grenadians and St. Lucians, and everybody's kind of represented there, but especially TNT and Jamaica and Barbados in Toronto. And because of that, you grow up and what's, popular culture in Toronto is Caribbean, essentially, especially in the 90s, especially in the 90s. And because of that, all the things that I enjoyed and that I experienced as a Black person in Toronto was thoroughly mediated through the lens of being a part of a very large Caribbean diaspora community. And, my family's from Sudan. And so growing up, being Sudanese, but also living in a kind of heavily kind of Caribbeanized Black metropolis, it was not like unordinary, it was totally normal for someone like me to just simply, the foods I like to eat were Caribbean foods, and the music I like to listen to was that as well. And that was the case for many, many Black people who either were or weren't from any of the islands in the West Indies. So there's that. And I also, was raised Muslim. And so I think that plays a huge part in how I approach everything, because at least in my own family and the way that I was encouraged to approach my faith was that, my father used to always say, what's the first word in the Quran? And one time I got it wrong. I was like, it's a shahada. He was like, no, it's Iqra, it's read, right? He said, even before the shahada is to read. And he said, if you're committing your life to pursuing knowledge, then you're doing what you need to do as a Muslim. Everything else comes after that very first thing, that very first instruction. And so I always took that very seriously. And even as a Muslim who was actually born in the Middle East and then raised in Toronto, I always understood that being a Muslim, there was an attention to text that was very, very important, that these are scholarly traditions that had paid attention to texts and reading practices as fundamental to the faith. And so I think all of these things came together to make me who I am. And to me, people kind of look at me and they're like, like, what's the story there? But the story is really typical for Toronto, maybe not for some of the other places I've lived in the US, but definitely for Toronto.
And when you talk about, community, it's very important to look at it as a constellation. It's multiple. So, when we think about community, it also goes into language, how language also arrests the way that we go about our political, our economic, whatever project that we are attempting to do. We're also using a certain level of discourse, a certain level of language, which as we are moving, quickly, and we're moving slowly, I should say, into your book project. But before we do that, you talk about these constellations. You really talk about the intellectual. You talk about Hortense Spillers. You talk about, obviously Paul Gilroy. So you're being influenced in an institutional sense, you also are being influenced by a non-institutionality about how you are moving into the world. There's an ethos that is there. How does Black studies, what were those points? What about Black studies um, really kind of moved you or said that, these are the ways within which you can actually re-enter the work and expand upon what you initially set out to do?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I think it started with, I definitely cut my teeth in kind of like student organizing. And, I was on the Black Student Union and like did all these things. And I was just so radical, I really knew it all. And I just was like, I've read every book, I've done every march, I've done it all. But I realized that something had happened, right, to me in my thinking, because of how I was forced to constantly smuggle in Black studies through a normative discipline. I felt that it had done something to me. I felt that it had thrown my barometer off for what the default was and for what Black studies could be for me in my life. I was tired of having it play this kind of clandestine role in my essays that I would write. And I was tired of having to smuggle it in through different language, knowing that it has its own language. And like you said, language, we need it because we need it to relate, but it also encloses at the same time, whatever it is that we're trying to express. And I felt like, okay, if I'm going to have to like concede to some enclosure of language, I would like for it to be something else than this one that I was given. And, especially because I was reading people like Cedric Robinson, who like, come on, if you're doing political theory and Black, like, you're like, it's possible. People do it. And so I would like to do it. And, Tony Bogues as well, like all of these people. And so I was tired of having to do that work of like smuggling it in through another discipline, knowing that there was an option for me, that I would have to leave Canada, which was going to be difficult, but that there was an option that people do it. And so I simply decided that I was just going to be one of those people to do it. And I realized that Black studies, and this is something that I've learned in my own relationship that I've, developed with Sylvia, who was another person in that kind of, we all have our saints, right? And so she's up there with them, along with Tony and, everybody else. What she told me about the early years of Black studies at Stanford, which she was a part of, creating that kind of pedagogical and political vision for what Black studies was. And I remember she told me, and this is in my interview that I did with her, I asked her, what did they think of Black studies at the time? And she said, well, what do you mean? They just didn't think of it at all, right? But what meant that they could simply just go about doing and trying anything. And so I'd always understood Black studies as this place where you could try something, right? You could try pretty much, it has to be careful, it has to be thoughtful, it has to be fastidious, but it's a place where you can try. And that you are not there to simply build monuments to dead ideas that don't necessarily work anymore, or to simply just like signify and appeal to novelty for novelty's sake, right? It was a place where you were always walking the tightrope of both of those things at the same time and trying something else in that process. And that's certainly what I wanted to do. And things I kept from political theory. There's a reason why I'm committed to studying concepts, and I got that from political theory. That's not something I shy away from. Like, paying attention to concepts is something that's very useful that I carried over from political theory into Black studies, because that's also a primary preoccupation for Black study, as it were. And then finally, I think the reason why I wanted to pursue like Black studies PhDs, even though I'd never been exposed to any Black studies program in Canada, was because I knew that if I was going to do anything, I had to try something different than what I'd already been trying, that I couldn't just do what I'd already been doing and then expect something else. And this is something that I learned from reading these intellectuals on the side, that I didn't have space. I could see that all of them at some point in their life, they made like a hard left, like something happened where they broke with themselves in a way. And I noticed that, and I said to myself, not to liken myself to any of these people, but as a young person, coming of age, the idea is that you have to kind of like break with something and leap into a different part of your life, and this was part of it for me as well. So it was a deeply personal thing as well as intellectual.
And what is interesting here is that one of the things I would really kind of set the conversation up is that you actually talked about being steeped in Black studies in the first place, and even though institutionally, through the normative fashion of going through an academy and programs, but the community who you
Yeah.
were bringing in Islam, bringing in these particular components, the ethics, the reading, those particular ways of what is considered to be Black study, those quotidian ways of Black folk, you know, finding possibilities and spaces and cracks in time, resisting those categories of time, reimagining, locating language. That becomes important as well. So you're doing all of this as you're moving. You know, of course, you're engaged. You mentioned that you know, radical or engaged in different types of marches and organizing on campus. But now you're developing that project. You're developing that to a particular, more formalistic way where people can pick up your ideas and people can and extract from. But again, you're coming out of a tradition. You're coming out
Right.
of people who were giving.
Yeah,
And so
they're not
you're
my ideas.
right.
Not my
Exactly.
Yeah, I actually don't believe in this idea that like I've made like some kind of like novel like I don't, like other people say it to me and I say, well, fine, if you see that, then I'm happy for you. But for me, I don't actually see that. And it's way more generative for me to not think about like what is mine, but rather to think about what tradition am I in and how am I extending it. And I think a lot of the work that we see as kind of novel or path breaking is that way simply because it's extending what's already there into maybe a different arena or asking a different question, but it's really extending what's already there and kind of giving it more, adding to the robustness of that thing that's already there. And like you said, just because there wasn't any Black Studies department in where I was doesn't mean, I lived in a city where Dion Brand is the poet. I'm from Toronto. Norbese Phillip, Ronaldo Walcott, Catherine McKittrick, all of these Black intellectuals that were, let me tell you, cooking with grease at the time that I was in school and before that as well. There was never a lack of intellectuals doing that kind of work. I just knew that at my age and at the point I was in my life, I needed a kind of space that was like more formal, where I could have more guided instruction because, I needed that. But Black Studies was always alive and well, and Black Study was always alive and well in Canada, all over Canada, because of this. And I knew because of that, there was no institution that could enclose the project of Black Studies, that with or without a department, that the crucial work is not at the institutional level. It's everywhere else, so.
The tradition is of being, insurrectionary, like, making space, in that particular way. Let's turn to your current project. Let's turn to your current book, let's talk about that. Let's spend a significant amount of time of really kind of unpacking this conceptualization of catastrophe. You argue in the that you just wrote not so long ago, was it like last year, I believe it was? Last year. You I guess it's like the introduction of what's happening right now. Talk a little bit more about, this project, Catastrophe, the book, and what is it that you're trying to do? Again, what is it that you're trying to break open here?
Yeah. It's hard to, when better than me because you've been in this profession long, when you've been like working on something so much that you've like even forget what it is, that you get kind of like lost in the sauce. So this is a good question. It's going to lead me back to the nuts and bolts of this thing. So I will preface this by saying, like, I was 15 when Hurricane Katrina happened. And, I was in Toronto, but I think a lot of other millennials share this sentiment with me that I don't think, younger folks understand what it was that we witnessed, right, on TV during Hurricane Katrina. My mother, who had witnessed all kinds of things on TV and in real life, like, wars and I had never seen her respond to anything the way she responded to Hurricane Katrina. And she actually said to me that that for President Bush, the worst thing for him and was not necessarily Iraq, it was Katrina, in her opinion. And this is a woman who lived in Iraq, right? And had family there and who watched what happened in Iraq. And she still thought that the worst thing on his record was Hurricane Katrina. And I tried to explain this to my students once where, TV was different then, right? We all sat in front of like maybe the one TV that you might have at home. And every night the news came on at the same time and everybody would watch it. And this is just what people did. And what they showed on the news was bloated, dead Black people, corpses, right? No pretense even for some kind of even a liberal nonsense respect for all of it gone. Right? You are seeing dead bodies, their faces not covered, nothing. Right? You are watching, journalists are there and they're having nervous breakdowns on TV, right? The most famous one is, of Anderson Cooper being there, and he has a nervous breakdown on TV. And he says, I'm someone who covered the war in Yugoslavia. And he has a nervous breakdown on television, right? And all of these journalists are there, and they've decided that they're not going to treat it as news. They're going to use all their airtime to simply beg people to come and help, right? And 15 years old and watching all of this play out for 11 days straight, right? Until they sent aid. So they sent the military on day one. On the 11th day, they sent aid and people to collect the dead. That has never left me, ever, ever. It's the thing that made me an anti-racist. It's the thing that made me politicize. It is the moment in my young life that had changed literally everything. So because of that, and then, being a millennial, it's like Katrina. But then right before that, it was the Iraq War. And then immediately after that, it was the Afghanistan War and all these biggest protests in history, second to George Floyd now, but the biggest protests in the whole history of the world, right? War in Afghanistan. There was a recession. Then on top of that, I'm being fed this discourse as a teenager that you don't actually have any future, right? Because the planet is going to die before you can do anything meaningful with your life. And so you think about that as a young person, one thing after another. But the difference between my generation and my parents' generation was that my parents' generation had at least the idea that you can make things better. Your children can come and improve. What we didn't have that benefit, right? We were being told that was it. That's all we would ever know and understand and experience. And so this idea of the interminability of catastrophe is not like a theoretical kind of like signifier. Like I'm not just trying to show off and like do something conceptually. I was looking around at what was happening and thinking to myself, there's something about the way catastrophe, or if you want to call it disaster, works that is not just one event and then we have to pick up and go on. Like it seems to be conditioning everything. The way I think, the way I'm understanding myself in the world. And this was as a teen, I understood this, right? So that's really where it came from. And then finally, I get to graduate school, and at graduate school, this is where a lot of like Anthropocene studies is coming to a head as a formalized area of study, right? Because why? Because now all the millennials are in graduate school and are trying to think about what are we going to do, right? And so we now become invested so possessively as a kind of generation of scholars in Anthropocene studies because of what we had experienced as teens, right? And I think that's something that a lot of people don't recognize is that, the reason why Anthropocene studies is popping right now is because we are the generation that was told there's nothing for you. And so now we've thrown all of our energy into studying this thing. But I was still noticing that how can it be that I didn't understand this preoccupation with trying to like figure out how many more years was left on the clock, like 12 more years, 50 more years. I was like, who wants 50 more years of any of this? Why not just let it all go? I would prefer that over trying to like perfect the science to give us like 10 more, 15 more, 50 more years. But I also realized as not just a millennial, but as a Black millennial experiencing these things that that's not actually how this works. How it works is that there is a kind of condition of catastrophe and that things just kind of repeat in this brutal way over and over again, unless something major is done to interrupt that brutal repetition. And again, this is something I was thinking before I came to the conceptual theoretical language for it. And I also was thinking to myself, okay, well, in the appendix to the Black Jacobins, C.L.R. James tells me, and I believe him, before I don't believe other people, I believe him when he says that the plantation was the first factories and that they were industrialization, right? So if the Anthropocenic frame, which is already like the periodization is very funny, but let's just say it's true that industrialization impacted, right, the processes of the earth, and this is how much time we have left. They locate it in Europe. And so I said, how could these people leave out the people who were present from the very beginning of the process? Black people on plantations. And they get the beginning wrong, and we're supposed to believe them about what the end is. To me, that didn't make any sense, right? And it also seemed to me that the idea of the end was just that, an idea. It was more apparent than it was real, because every time an endpoint had been given to me as a young person, the year 2000, then it was 2012, and then it was like, okay, 7 more years, and then it's 2.5 Celsius. All of this like calculations happening to tell me what exactly that what was happening is still happening now, right? I didn't understand that, and I certainly didn't understand that these people got the beginning wrong, they got the end point wrong because of that. And also the idea of the end was just a signifier, and it was being used to manipulate people. That the end is like, I mean, does anything ever really end? Like, I don't know, nobody, like, who knows? But the idea of the end was fundamental in each iteration of that repetition. I knew that, because I knew that in each moment where the catastrophic arrived as like the thing that was important, the idea of the end was the thing that was used to manipulate us into conceding to this story and to this language that was being given to us. And after a while, as a young person, I was like, I don't know if I believe them about their calculations about the end. Like, they've been getting it wrong for a while. And I was looking around me and I thought, am I crazy? Because everybody else knows that their calculations were wrong before, but they still believe these people when they say there's like 13 years. I said, why not? I knew for myself, I was like, I have to get off of this clock, not even as an intellectual project. I said, I have to remove myself from this clock. I cannot do anything in my generation. We've been told nothing is, I have to get off this clock, because there's no other way I can just like live my life. I'm getting off of this clock that tells me there's 13 years left, this like midnight on the clock thing. I am getting off of it because I know that the way that bad things have happened, at least in my lifetime, doesn't work that way. And then that's when, after that, the kind of like flowery intellectual stuff came along, right? Where I started to kind of find already existing language for that. And because of that, I realized that, okay, so the end, they're wrong about it happening. We don't know if and when it will happen, but we know that the idea of the end is what propels the repetition of this thing that was the same. But what repeats is the way of life and the structure and the condition, but not the historical moment. That doesn't repeat. And so because of that, each repetition is like a repetition with a twist. And it's enough of a twist to make us feel like this has never happened before. And that's why you'll have literally the exact same thing happening in the same place, like a hurricane of the same category in the same place, and people will say, this is unprecedented. It's because that each repetition comes with enough of a twist to like liquidate our own social and historical memory of that sameness. And because of that, the repetition propels itself. And I was like, I think I'm onto something. Like, I think, and it was not me trying to just be, I was just looking around and talking about what it was I was seeing. So a very long answer, but it was a long process thinking about it.
Thank you, because I mean, there was a few things here that you mentioned, and then of course I want to posit this question so you're thinking about it, right?
Yeah.
How do we understand the limits of the Anthropocene? That's what I'm gonna posit that. But before you answer that, I'm thinking here, because you're talking about possibilities, you're looking at time being arrested in a colonial sense that, and then you mentioned something that was very interesting. The historical moment doesn't repeat itself. But what about the ways of being, or the forms of knowledge in those moments? How do they carry themselves forward? Because it seems to me there's a relationship there. Right? You're talking about the conceptualization of time, this limiting of the possibilities that the end is near. So you got this limited time, you're wasting time. It's all capitalist. This is all capitalist notions of capturing the essence of the essence of a human, right? The way that we think, the way that we move, the spirituality, the way, everything.
Right.
Talk about that a little bit more. Talk about, those forms of knowledge and those ways of being that actually carry over.
Yeah. I mean, what's interesting is, you know, I learned from Sylvia, right? This idea that she proposes that our physical bodies don't perceive the stories that we tell about those physical bodies. And from that, I also can determine that our physical earth does not perceive the story that we tell about that earth. And because of that, I also learned from Sylvia that, if we as humans want to appear in the world differently, physically, the flesh part itself as well, the material part, we would have to implement a different story about who we are. And I definitely believe the same is for the planet, that if we want the planet to physically feel different to us, we have to introduce a different story about what it means to be on this planet. And we can do that. But the story that we've authorized, which is the Anthropocenic one, it gets all the major players wrong. It gets the plot wrong, everything. So why not simply? And part of what I struggled with was, I think early on, I kept being conscripted into trying to make this project more so a critique of the Anthropocenic frame, right? That was, you're not citing enough Anthropocene studies, you're not, engaging. And my problem was that I wanted to simply decamp from the frame entirely, that at some point we have to recognize that we reached the limit of this frame, and that, crossing outside of this frame is not going to look very pretty. It's going to be maybe clunky and cumbersome. And I think that's probably true of, the way I'm theorizing things, but I'm just trying something because, again, I didn't invent this, but I know that there's a tradition that tells me something else, and that I really want to try and bring it together in such a way that folks can understand and appreciate. So there's that. But then I also am thinking about how, and Clyde Wood says this in Development Drowned, he talks about, not in a dissimilar way to how Cedric Robinson talks about all the cosmologies that were carried over in the Middle Passage by enslaved Africans. And that included senses of time. You had people who, were on, for example, the lunar calendar. You had people who were on a completely different calendar, neither Gregorian, neither lunar, something else. You had people who kept time by the 5 calls to prayer every day. You had others who kept time by making, marking the Sabbath or marking harvest. You had all these different clocks and senses of time that were carried over in the Middle Passage. And because of that, we know that Black people have always been on a different clock to the one given to us. And because of that, not always subscribing to this kind of like linear conception of time. They do, and there's also other senses of time, right? That kind of like I guess you could call it contrapuntal time if we're borrowing that kind of literary phrase, right? This idea that you have these different lines and sometimes they're harmonious and sometimes they're dissonant. That's also how time works for Black people, because they came over with their own senses of time and have to now concede in many ways to standard Gregorian clock time. But because of that, I think Black people, and because, like C.L.R. James tells us, Black people in the Americas have been present from the very beginning of this process. Black people in the Americas are the ones that have embedded in their worldviews and their modes of relationality and their ways of life mechanisms for moving on, and knowing that moving on is a process that will have to happen again and again, because they have lived. And I mean, C.L.R. James has that line in the Black Jacobins where, I can't remember it specifically, but every day the slave dreaded the sunrise because he knew that it was the possibility of that same thing over, but then also still endeavoring something else, marinage, poison, all these things, right? So it's this idea that you're caught inside of this brutal repetition, and that in each repetition, you perfect something about the refusal of that thing each time. And that's something that Black people have always understood, because they've always lived under this idea, this catastrophic condition. It's not simply that like once a year something bad will happen. It's that life every day is conditioned in such a way that that is the bad thing, is life itself, right? And I was like, okay, well, this makes sense. And then I was reading poets more than anybody else. And, I read Kemal Brathwaite saying that, in the New World, in the Americas, Black people have tried to break down the pentameter. And, this idea that the pentameter is more than just like a technical thing for poetry. It's anything that encloses language itself and therefore encloses life, right? And that Black people have always tried to bridge or break it down, right? So come up with these kind of ways to bring two things together or to break it down completely. And he says that the hurricane doesn't roar in the pentameter. I was like, okay, there is something there. And then I'm reading Derek Walcott, and he's telling me about twilight time, right? This idea that you're caught between the old and the new, right? And that you're trapped in this predicament, but that you're not actually trying to find the escape hatch, that you dwell in that twilight time, and out of that comes a language that is both old and new at the same time. It makes something else possible. And I was like, trapped, trapped, and time seems like it's not moving. That is also very interesting, right? And these poets, right, are thinking about the same thing. They're thinking about those Africans that were carried over and had their own senses of time, different way of understanding the here and the now, the here and the hereafter, the now and the then and the then,
Mm-hmm.
And all of this together suggested to me that the response to this thing called catastrophe is going to have to figure out this time problem, right? And it's going to be one, getting off of the clock, not subscribing to this nonsense story that we've been fed about the planet, so refusing the story and in a narrative sense, and also understanding that there has been different senses of time that have carried us consistently inside of these repetitions. And that because of that, it's what Sylvia Wynter says in Black Metamorphosis, that Black people had already been people who on the African continent were always on the move. And because of that, they carried over with them this propensity for what she calls domesticating change. And she said, the African in the Middle Passage and then the American bluesmen, they had the same thing, which was that they always kept their traveling shoes nearby, is what she said. And the thing that Black people have always done inside of this repetitious thing is they've always kept their traveling shoes ready, because you don't know when there might be a small opening, a window. And when it's time to go, there's no time to waste. You go, right? Because time doesn't work the same way. That time to go feels shorter. If it's a minute, that minute feels like 10 seconds, right? That opportunity to do something else. And it's not always a good outcome, right? Sometimes that process of picking up your traveling shoes and going, it's bad. Sometimes it results in more death and more suffering and more of it. But the idea is that when there's an opening, you go. And you don't know what's on the other side of that opening. So I'm not like overly pessimistic, and I'm certainly not a cruel optimist. Like, I'm not saying that you need catastrophe in order to have possibility. And I actually don't think that catastrophe is equated to possibility. All I'm saying is that if we understand catastrophe in this way, then we might be able to better understand how we're going to live on this planet together. And that could look good, that could look bad. But in any case, we do have a say. We don't actually have to concede. Because once you've conceded to that story, you've lost everything once you've conceded to that. And so I pulled all of these things together, and I was like, yeah, now it makes sense that when terrible things happen and Black people either stay in a place of great suffering or leave a place of great suffering, that in any case, in both of those places, what moving on looks like, it looks like, making art. It looks like writing poetry and songs to commemorate the dead. It looks like, for example, holding the second line part of the 2-line funeral, because, you don't need the body for the second line. The body's already been cut loose. So you can do that part anywhere in the world and over and over and over again. Right? But you would need a different sense of time for that.
Speaking of, right now, COP 26, 27th, whatever is going on right now. We're having this conversation about, planetary crisis at the same time of really reimagining the way that we're approaching it. And this is what you're doing, particularly with, kind of unpacking this notion of catastrophe, as you say, not as a juxtaposition between Anthropocene, because you're trying to move outside of those discourses to get us to start thinking about time direct relationship to the earth itself differently. And this is very, very interesting, because when you say it, I'm gonna quote you here
Oh
in your
no.
particular in your particular piece. You say what you're offering is a way out of our tendency to use the term catastrophe as an ahistorical or transhistorical category. Since, as we know, there's no such categories, and a way of thinking about catastrophe uh, with Black radical thought, right? So you're thinking about this in the context of all of these folk who are really trying to understand the human condition through Black studies, through an Africana ontology, through an Africana way of being, throughout of all of these particular processes, whether it was enslavement, colonialism, the plantation, all of these things. So you're looking at this frame of trying to really get a again, to have us have different conversations, to think about, where our shoes are when it's time to go. when it's, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. And what is interesting is that being in Black studies is what helped me develop that perspective, because one thing that I've noticed that is really frustrating is that we, when I say we, I mean academics, like in a professional sense. There's a problem. And that problem is that when we do talk about catastrophe, we only talk about the lava erupting, the hurricanes, the earthquakes, all of these, and studying the people that I've studied, like C.L.R. James and Sylvia, and et cetera, they have shown me, right, that what was brutal about the New World was this granular, everyday, in and out, low hum of violence. And that sometimes you get these like explosions on the surface, but those are not actually, that's not where the problem is. The problem is that low hum every single day. And I think that we don't pay attention to that enough. And that when we talk about catastrophe, we only are talking about those big kind of explosions that happen on the surface, that once that low hum reaches a point, every once in a while, these explosions happen. And those explosions are also repetitious. So even in our knowing that the repetition, we still monumentalize them more than they deserve. And we develop a fixation with them. Now, where this fixation comes from, in my estimation, is that, if you're only talking about earthquakes and lava and hurricanes and et cetera, then, and two things. So you're only talking about those things. And as academics, a lot of times the conversations around catastrophe are only about aesthetics. And like, I'm someone that uses aesthetics a lot, but a lot of times the conversation is only about aesthetics. And so you're talking about, the kind of like semiolinguistic formations of whatever it is that is happening. In any case, right, it gets away from that low hum, kind of like everyday, brutal, repetitious thing, and also betrays, I think, a bigger problem, which is even us as Black scholars, right, in our tendency to only talk about these kinds of big bang things that happen, and or only talk about aesthetics. And don't get me wrong, aesthetics is central to what I'm doing, right? But in doing that, we are in a large part just rehearsing Kant's aesthetics. Like, it's the sublime, the grotesque, the beautiful. It is the preoccupation with the sublime that is one and the same as the preoccupation with catastrophe for us as Black scholars. And I think that we're only concerned with catastrophe as a vessel for our preoccupation with the sublime. And I think that's not okay. And I think what happens as a result is, and I said this before, like on a panel once, and it wasn't very popular, but I think it's true, that a lot of times we do all this kind of like signifying. Like, you'll be having a conversation around like ecology and catastrophe, and it's all this like signifying happening, excessive abstraction and metaphorization. And this is coming from me. Like, anyone who's read anything that I've written, it is like not necessarily literal, right? Like I love to signify. I recognize that I can only go so far because I'm not a poet. So we don't have the technical skill for that. And because of that, what ends up happening is we reproduce the idea that just looking around and talking about what's happening is not sophisticated intellectually, and that it's heavy-handed, and that it's not subtle. And that's not true, right? And it drives me, I feel so totally nuts sometimes because you could really be in a conversation around ecology and catastrophe, and like actually talking about how many people died might not actually even come up, right? Because it's only a conversation about aesthetics, and a certain kind of aesthetics. It's not the aesthetics that Clyde Woods is talking about, which responds to this catastrophic. It's not the aesthetics that Sylvia is talking about, or what have you, right? Or it's like this signifying, like, I'm going to use the idea of the hurricane to explain such a hurricane is a hurricane and people will die, right? And at some point we will need to talk about that. And so I also think that my project is responding to this idea that to be theoretical, you can't actually ground yourself in what's going on around you, right? That like, in order for it to be quote unquote sophisticated, you have to remove yourself as much as possible from the place and time in which you are and from the people around you in order to do that. And that is it's a very American thing also. I don't know that is very strange to me. Hopefully it's people will just stop it. I don't know if they will, but
Good luck with that. That's well wished. That's well wishing right there.
yeah. Yeah.
You know, but let's spend a little bit, and I also want to honor your time as well. I don't want to keep you too much longer. But I really want to spend a little bit time on Sylvia Wynter's Black Metamorphosis, which you use in your work. And I don't want to limit, but I find it to be very interesting as a connective tissue here. Particularly with you use McKittrick's work, of course. You mentioned a number of other Walcott work, but Sylvia Wynter's work, and it's interesting because we find a lot of times that there's kind of like this fetishization of Wynter's work, and and now there's going to be, I'm afraid, this Black study is going to be another one of these things, but these things require deep study, deep work, a constant process. And you use this. Could you talk a little bit more about the framing? What about Sylvia Wynter, Black Metamorphosis, kind of helps you ground and connect these various strands of thoughts here?
Well, I always say that like my book is like a call and response between Clyde Woods and Sylvia Wynter, because I think there's something that happens to both of them that's like similar to each other, but on different ends of how they're understood. And so for, Clyde Woods, much of what people rehearse in terms of his contributions when it comes to blues epistemology is the blues side and not the episteme side, right? Like the whole epistemology side. And then for Sylvia, it's the opposite, right? Heavy on the episteme side and leaving out the expressive and aesthetic, right? And I'm like, that's so wild. Like she was a dancer and an artist and all of these things first and foremost. And Clyde Woods, he was an a systems thinker first and foremost before and I found it so weird that when we generally read them, we invert what it is that we leave out of the frame. And I felt like both of these thinkers were doing so much of the same thing, thinking about episteme, and also thinking about how Black people and how culture has been the terrain and the battleground for waging this epistemological movement on the frontier of this epistemological kind of break that they're looking for. And to me, it was so clear. I was like, why has nobody written a book where these two, right, are talking to each other mostly, and that everyone else is gathered around them? I thought it was so obvious, and I was so shocked that people weren't doing it all the time because it seems so abundantly clear. So there's that. And then for Black Metamorphosis, I think what I appreciated so much about it was that she was trying to do something that I'm now trying to do, which is to refuse the terms of a conversation altogether. And because, at the time, Black Metamorphosis, it grew out of her essay, John Canoe in Jamaica, which she published in 1968. And, because of how fantastic, and in that she talks about how, this, what she called the folk dance of John Canoe. And it was the terrain of a cultural guerrilla movement against the plantation system and the mechanism by which Black people in Jamaica had indigenized themselves in a new place. And, after that, because it was just such a fantastic essay and what have you. And so when Vincent Harding is in Jamaica, he invites her to the Institute of the Black World. And then at the Institute of Black World is when she ends up writing Black Metamorphosis. And she had initially wanted to write a book on minstrelsy in Mexico, Jamaica, US South, Brazil, and Mexico, and that it kind of moved away from that over time. And she ended up with this idea of Black metamorphosis. But essentially what she was doing was she was trying to think about the conversations that were happening at the time in Black studies about what it meant to be a Black person in the New World. And to her, she didn't buy the kind of Herskovits angle of, Black people in the New World, when they do things, they're just like are cataloging all the things that were carried over from Africa, right? She didn't subscribe to the kind of like creolization thesis, which is like these two things meet together and blend, because she was like, sometimes they do, sometimes they don't, sometimes it's violent, and sometimes it's like, And she also didn't, and she takes direct aim at this specifically, is Harold Cruz's claim in The Crisis of the Intellectual, where he says that cultural, expression in the Americas is wholly of the Americas when it comes to Black people, because they've been denuded of their Africanity during the Middle Passage. And she was not satisfied with any of these conversations, because she said, I'm from Jamaica, and I know that there's something else, right? On the one hand, no, we're not just like cataloging all of our Africanities, but there were significant things that were carried over, right? So there's that. And, no, we were not denuded of our Africanity, but some of these things do feel brand new, right? At the same time, and of the Americas. And yes, things come together, but sometimes they come together, the creolization thesis, but sometimes they come together in a way that's asymmetrical. That's, she knew there was something else. And so that's where she develops this idea that, Black people and all of the expressive cultural mediations and mediums that are engaged in the Americas, the idea is that things were not necessarily lost on the Middle Passage or kept intact, but that they were subject to metamorphosis over time. And that metamorphosis was a process that continued, and that metamorphosis was fundamental to the process of indigenization in the New World. So that things that feel old and new at the same time, you're right, they are old and new at the same time. And I thought to myself, it's possible. It's actually possible to watch all of these major intellectual debates going on, and to simply not want to participate in any of them, to try and think about a different thing, a different way. And she'd also done what I'm also trying to do was, I was like, she is tracing a history of the concept of the Black. And it's not starting in the New World, right? It's also not starting in Europe, right? In the way that maybe Cedric Robinson, but it's starting on the shores of Africa, and it's not happening in the Middle Passage. She's starting from a different place altogether and offering a different conceptual history of this thing that we call Black. And I was like, I would like to do something like that with catastrophe. I would like to start somewhere else and find out where these transformations in the concept, happened. What about these old ideas around calamity did we keep, and what was metamorphosed and transformed into something else when we get in the New World? And why is it that in the New World things are pronounced in a certain way? It was my methodology, Black metamorphosis. That was my method. I was like, I've seen a method for what I'm trying to do. Now I am not Sylvia, so it's a little clunkier. Not as nice sounding, but I tried. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very important, because the framework becomes important. And also, I'm thinking about Vincent Harding, and of course, Vocation of the Black Scholar, and the questions that we form, and the questions that we think about, and the different questions that we need to ask to lead to different solutions become essential. Which, as we kind of come to a close, this kind of is a really good point to kind of pivot a little bit to a little bit of the other projects that you have going on, particularly with the Black Critique series that you have going on. Could you talk a little bit more about that? And again, there's probably about 5 or 6 more things, but we're going to pause here. Yeah. But I really want you to talk about, that, the Black Critique series, and what does that have to do in the context of the overall objective of your work?
Yeah, I mean, I am fortunate to have had Tony Bogues as a mentor, because I think because of that, I mean, anyone who knows him knows that he is fastidious, right? When it comes to reading and really being careful and sober-minded about how you use ideas and concepts, and how you write about things, how you talk to people, how you interact with people, all of it. And I always understood from the very beginning that Black study and Black studies was not just about what was happening in the classroom. I was always working on other things, alongside him, whether it was the SNCC Vets project or the George Lamming papers or a whole bunch of things. It was never, I never had the assumption that that was, I guess, an adjacent logic to what was happening in the classroom, or that it was an appendage to what was happening in the classroom. They were both equally important, always already from the very beginning of the process I had with him as my mentor. And so because of that, he has a very robust method for mentoring, which is to show you everything that's required in order to be a scholar that is actually contributing something of use that's useful. And one of those things is books and editing and publishing. And so when I was in my last year of graduate school, he asked me, you know, what do you think about working on this series with me? Like, I know you're trying to finish your dissertation, you're about to start this job, but if you start it now and you know, it's already part of your, you know, workload from the very beginning, then this is something that you can keep doing because it's important. Like, you know, having people who read manuscripts and send things through for production, et cetera, and so forth, with a certain kind of politics and a way of reading. This is what determines, you know, what gets published, what gets circulated, especially with like a leftist press, like Pluto Press, which is not like your kind of typical press. And he impressed on me the importance of, okay, you know, producing scholarship is not just this writer in the attic thing. Like, there's also the nuts and bolts part of production, of producing scholarship. I had no idea. The things, right, that go on behind that. And I'm so deeply, immensely appreciative, because let me tell you, writing a book after having read however many manuscripts, you have to pick up on things. And the other thing is that there are some people, right, who their ideas will not be circulated in a way that is like mainstream or accessible if people are not putting them on their back and like carrying it through the production process at publishers. And that's just a reality. And I think that, you know, he showed me that even when you're working with a publisher, that you can do things the way you want to do, that you don't have to like concede to whatever industry says should be or shouldn't be published, that there's always a way to do something. It might not be, you know, I'm not like an editor at Random House or some big trade press. It's a small leftist publisher, but we get to do what we want to do. We get to do things like earmarking a certain number of copies for every number sold to a prison education program. We get to do that. We get to put through manuscripts and books for someone like Lorenzo Combo Urban, who wrote the first actual book on Black anarchism and had never had it published by a kind of traditional publishing press after 40 something years, right? It just takes a couple of people in a particular place to like do something. And because of that, and now this is something that I will always I'll continue to do, is try to work at least on this side of the production side of being a scholar, because it's crucial and we take it for granted. We like send manuscripts through and then they pop up in the thing and then in the whatever revision and then like they come out and it's like, no, there's so many things that happen behind the scenes. And I want to know how the sausage is made, you know?
That's very important. And that's a very, very important insight, because I'm also thinking about, you know, coming out of a tradition of organizers who were producing and going through the processes of creating pamphlets, getting them printed, you know, making sure that there's an editing process, you know, all of that becomes very important. And, you know, I guess, you know, we can end here, but I wonder if the way of producing knowledge as it's changed rapidly. The landscape has changed rapidly. You know, that particular point. I'm wondering about how that will be impacted moving forward with different publishing and different production and those types of things like that. So with that being said, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us and have this conversation today. There's many more things that I'm sure we could talk about, but I definitely want to make sure that I honor your time and you have a great rest of your day. Hopefully we'll connect again soon.
Thank you so much. It
Yeah, la la, yeah, yeah.
That's it for Africa World Now Project for this week. I would like to thank you for joining us today and look forward to spending time with you next week. Follow us on Twitter at AFWRLDNWPRJ. Instagram at Africa World Now Project. Access to our other media platforms can be reached through the bios of our social media. Email africaworldnowproject@gmail.com. I'm your host and producer, James Pope. The Africa World Now Project Collective consists of international media journalist, executive producer, and human rights activist Muiza Muntali, Africa World Now Project media correspondent Funa Ngonda, senior research content contributor and production director Dr. Tasneem Siddiqui, senior research content contributor and production associate Dr. Josh Myers, associate producer and content contributor Dr. Keisha Khan Perry, content contributor and filmmaker Kurt Watterson, technology advisor is Byron Gray of Grayworks Technologies, and creative directors, international creative and artist designer Tabassum Siddiqui and Judah Pope. Africa World Now Project can be heard every Wednesday at 7 p.m. on WSNC, NPR affiliate and broadcast service of Winston-Salem State University. Programs are archived and available on all podcast platforms. Search Africa World Now Project. Until next week, be safe, be peaceful, and above all, be intelligent.
Boom.